Across Italy, from the silent forests of Lazio to the windswept plateaus of Sardinia, stand megastructures so ancient, so precise, and so unlike anything around them that they feel as though they were left behind by a world we barely remember. Walls cut from stone no tool mark can explain, pyramids carved from single volcanic masses, tomb cities underground, towers older than their legends, and corridors hollowed through bedrock with a purpose no one can agree on. Each structure fits into history, but never comfortably. Each answers one question while raising five more, and together they whisper a possibility we still don't know how to confront. What if Italy's oldest monuments belong to a chapter of human ingenuity we haven't yet uncovered? Cyclopean walls of Alatri. In the hills of southern Lazio, where the light drifts softly across terraced olive groves and the air carries the faint mineral scent of ancient limestone, the Cyclopean walls of Alatri rise with a quiet authority that seems older than the town that surrounds them, older even than the stories layered across this landscape, presenting a geometry so deliberate and a craftsmanship so resolute that their presence feels less like the residue of a bygone era and more like a message left in stone from a time that resisted being remembered. For the blocks here, immense, angular, interlocking without mortar, press against one another with a precision that invites consideration of the intention behind their arrangement, as if a forgotten hand once understood how to persuade unyielding rock into shapes and alignments that endure beyond the fragile sweep of names, kingdoms, and archives. And as one walks the perimeter where the polygonal masonry tightens into immaculate joints, the sensation grows that these walls were not the perimeter of a fortress, but the expression of an architectural language still half lost, a language whose vocabulary blends astronomical orientation with topographical command. For the great Porta Maggiore, with its towering trapezoidal frame, faces the landscape in a way that evokes more than strategic utility, suggesting instead a dialogue with the horizon, while the town's acropolis, crowned by walls that fit together like the facets of a single stone thought, occupies a vantage point that dominates the valley with a composure that makes the chronology assigned to it feel provisional. And even as scholars trace these structures to the Italic peoples and the Hernisi tribes, the stones themselves resist that simplicity, carrying weathering patterns that hint at cycles of exposure measured less in centuries and more in epochs, their surfaces bearing scars of seismic shifts and climatic passages that imply a history long enough to complicate the neat arc of regional development. Yet the mystery here is not merely the age of the stones, but the method behind their making, for no clear evidence shows the tools that could carve and contour such vast boulders with edges that meet so flush, the seams vanish in shadow. No marks remain that would reveal how these tons were lifted, rotated, and fitted into place with such intention that even today engineers note the absence of settling or displacement, despite tremors that have reshaped every other structure in the region. And so, the walls evoke an argument between competing explanations, whether they were the product of a long and incremental evolution of Italic stonework traditions, or a sudden flowering of skill, now scattered into fragments across the peninsula. And as one moves deeper into the Acropolis, the geometry becomes more insistent, with angles that appear to reference celestial events, terraces aligned to solar arcs, and doorways whose tapered silhouettes echo other polygonal sites across Italy, suggesting a network of knowledge rather than isolated invention, though the threads linking them have eroded alongside the memories of the cultures that might have shared these techniques, leaving only the stones to whisper of an era where construction meant something more than shelter or defense. Yet even within the realm of archaeology, contradictions persist, for excavations produce pottery and artifacts consistent with known Italic habitation periods, while the walls themselves seem to stand apart from those layers, as though inherited, repurposed, or integrated into later settlements, rather than originating with them, a phenomenon mirrored in other ancient sites, where monumental bases outdate their own superstructures. And this tension creates a space for speculation, inviting conjectures about vanished workshops or forgotten guilds of masons whose mastery was unmatched, or about a knowledge stream flowing through prehistoric Italy that briefly surfaced here before disappearing into the obscurity that precedes documentation. And while such hypotheses cannot be confirmed, they persist because the stones refuse to simplify themselves into the timelines constructed for them. Instead, presenting the visitor with the sensation that the builders were engaging with principles that reached beyond immediate utility. Principles of proportion, balance, resilience, and perhaps even symbolism encoded into mass and form. And as dust settles across the Acropolis, the edges of the blocks catch the final gold of the sun, revealing contours that seem too considered to be chance and too enduring to belong solely to the historical moment to which they are assigned, creating a feeling that the walls are not merely ancient, but temporally untethered, belonging to a broader cycle of human ingenuity and forgetting. And though many theories attempt to resolve the enigma, ranging from lost construction traditions to misunderstood ceremonial landscapes, none fully reconcile the ambition, precision, and sheer presence of these stones. And so, Alatri remains suspended between explanation and wonder, its cyclopean walls a testament to an age that cannot be fully placed, and a mastery that cannot be fully named, leaving the enduring impression that beneath the known layers of Italy's past lies another stratum of intention, one carved into rock with a patience and authority that still holds its silence as though waiting for a question we have not yet learned to ask. Pyramid of Bomarzo. In the dense woodland north of Rome, where volcanic ridges break into quiet clearings and the undergrowth holds the smell of moss, soil, and thyme, the so-called Pyramid of Bomarzo emerges from the forest floor with a stillness that feels almost deliberate, its step terraces rising from a single outcrop of basalt, as though shaped not only by hands but by intention embedded within the stone itself. And as one approaches the structure, carved rather than constructed, sculpted downward rather than built upward, the sense grows that its form was guided by a logic that does not entirely align with the ceremonial models usually proposed, for the platforms ascend with a rhythm both architectural and geological, merging the raw endurance of cooled lava with a patterning that suggests repeated use, repeated refinement, or repeated significance across a span of years, longer than any inscription can confirm. And the steps, sharply cut yet softened by centuries of rain and leaf fall, lead the eye toward the small rectangular basins etched into the upper surfaces, their purpose open to interpretation. Perhaps altars for rituals, perhaps channels for offerings, perhaps nothing more than functional recesses for practices now forgotten, though their arrangement hints at an understanding of water flow and celestial light that belies the simplicity of the tools presumed available to the cultures associated with the region. Yet what complicates the story further is the absence of clear cultural signatures, for although the pyramid sits within territory known to have been inhabited by the Etruscans, the structure does not match the typology of their tombs nor the engineering of their temples, instead resembling a solitary experiment in sacred geometry, a monument aligned with the contours of the hill and the orientation of the sky in ways that invite comparison to far older expressions of ritual landscape across the Italian peninsula. And this dissonance between known cultural patterns and the singularity of Bomarzo has led to a quiet division among researchers, some proposing that the pyramid was a priestly retreat or astronomical observatory, others suggesting it may be a palimpsest of multiple occupations, where each group reshaped the stone for its own meanings, while a few entertain the possibility that it predates the Etruscans altogether, left behind by a community whose identity dissolved long before recorded history touched this forest. And standing at the summit, where the highest platform opens to the sky framed by treetops, the feeling deepens that the builders were not merely carving functional steps, but articulating a dialogue between earth and elevation, a space where ritual, movement, and perspective converged into a single path upward, though the absence of associated artifacts or architectural companions renders the site strangely isolated, like a sentence without a surviving paragraph, or a fragment of a larger ceremonial complex lost to erosion, landslide, or simply the slow reclamation of the forest. Contradictions emerge as well in the stone's weathering patterns, for while the surfaces exhibit erosion consistent with great age, certain cuts remain unexpectedly crisp, raising questions about whether the monument was periodically reworked or whether the basalt itself preserves shape with a persistence that misleads attempts at dating, and the terraces, though uneven in their preservation, retain proportions that reveal an underlying symmetry, suggesting that the builders were attentive not only to the steps, but to the spatial relationships between each platform, the vantage lines, the angles of ascent, and the shifting of shadows throughout the year. Details that hint at a sophistication not easily reconciled with the absence of corresponding structures in the vicinity. And so, the pyramid stands suspended in a perplexing quiet, a remnant of practices not fully understood, its terraces gathering leaves in autumn and holding snow in winter, with no inscriptions to claim authorship and no definitive traces of the rituals that once animated its stone surfaces, inviting the imagination to drift through hypotheses of forgotten cults, seasonal observances, territorial markers, or ancestral commemorations, each plausible yet unprovable, each echoing the larger pattern found across Italy's enigmatic constructions, where monumental intent survives but the cultural context fades, leaving only the architecture of memory without its story. And as the last rays of afternoon light angle through the trees, catching the basalt in a muted shimmer, the structure feels less like an artifact and more like a threshold, a place where the boundary between certainty and possibility thins, and the mind is left to contemplate how many. Other such forms once stood in ancient landscapes now transformed. How many gestures carved into stone have been erased by time's quiet insistence, and how the pyramid of Bomarzo, solitary yet resonant, remains a testament to a knowledge that once found expression in the shaping of volcanic rock into ascending plains, a knowledge now concealed within the forest's embrace, waiting for questions that have not yet been fully formed. Necropolis of Cerveteri. In the low, rolling landscape west of Rome, where the Tyrrhenian breeze moves across fields of wild fennel, and the earth occasionally opens in shallow depressions that hint at chambers beneath, the necropolis of Cerveteri spreads like a buried city, whose avenues and dwellings were carved not for the living, but for their echoes, its tumuli rising as gentle domes of earth and stone that disguise the architectural depth descending beneath them. And as one walks the ancient pathways, the scale of the place reveals itself slowly, each mound concealing a labyrinth of rooms patterned after houses, with corridors, pillars, benches, and carved beams that imitate timber, yet are wrought from volcanic tuff, giving the sensation that the Etruscans sought to preserve the familiar world in a medium more enduring than life, as though memory itself could be anchored in stone. And the tombs, spanning humble single chambers to vast multi-room complexes, seem less like funerary deposits and more like architectural tests, where domestic space, ritual space, and symbolic space intertwine into a single blueprint of a culture whose voice has mostly faded from the historical record, leaving behind only the impression of a people who saw continuity between the realms of living and dead, reflected in the uncanny precision with which these subterranean dwellings mirror the layout of the settlements that once stood nearby. Yet even as archaeology attributes the necropolis to the flourishing Etruscan world of the first millennium BCE, contradictions accumulate beneath the surface. For some of the earliest tumuli exhibit construction methods and spatial logic that differ subtly but distinctly from later layers, suggesting the reuse or adaptation of older funerary traditions whose origins remain obscure, while certain chambers, stripped of their original contents, bear carvings whose iconography has no clear parallel in the known corpus of Etruscan art. Fragments of a visual language perhaps inherited from predecessors now vanished from the record, and the sheer scale of Banditaccia, the largest of the necropolis zones, creates an architectural rhythm that reaches beyond what one might expect for a burial ground, with its grid-like arrangement of tumuli and streets forming a city plan so deliberate that researchers have long debated whether its scale served purely ceremonial needs or whether it reflects a deeper cosmological model, mapping the journey of the soul or the structure of the universe as the Etruscans imagined it. Though the absence of extensive written texts leaves only these stone imitations as clues, their proportions suggesting that meaning was once encoded in the spacing, the alignments, and the symbolic architecture of descent and return. Stepping inside one of the great tumuli, the air cool and still, the the walls bearing shallow carvings of household objects. The effect is disorienting, for the shapes of beds, chairs, beams, and door frames have been petrified into permanence. And this reproduction of daily life, in a space of death, raises the question of whether the tombs were intended as eternal homes, transitional chambers, or representations of something more abstract. A metaphysical household built to anchor the spirit in a journey now irretrievable to us, though the carefully modeled details imply a belief system both sophisticated and compassionate, granting their dead a continuity that transcends the finality we often assign to burial. Yet the necropolis also holds traces of complexity that resist interpretation, for beneath some mounds lie alcoves whose function is unclear, neither clearly ritual nor clearly domestic in imitation, and small niches whose placement seems too intentional to be incidental, as though they once housed offerings or symbols now lost. While in other areas the carving abruptly shifts style, leaving researchers pondering whether multiple guilds of stoneworkers operated here, each with distinct techniques, or whether the necropolis spans a far longer developmental arc than traditionally assigned, incorporating phases of practice that evolved in ways we cannot fully reconstruct. And contradictions extend to the geology itself, for the tuff, soft when freshly exposed but incredibly durable once set, has preserved details that feel startlingly modern in their precision. The clean lines of pillars and benches resisting erosion in ways that make dating by wear patterns misleading, sometimes giving the illusion of greater youth or greater age than stratigraphy alone can confirm. And thus the necropolis sits in a temporal ambiguity, its aesthetic coherence masking the layered evolution beneath it, where older tombs were expanded, repurposed, or sealed by later generations, creating a palimpsest of ritual, architecture that resists being assigned a single cultural moment. Wandering deeper into the site, where the pathways sink into shallow cuts between the mounds and the tomb, entrances face each other like rows of silent dwellings. The impression grows that this was once a ceremonial city with its own logic of processions, gatherings, and commemorations, its monumental scale reflecting not merely reverence for the dead, but an attempt to articulate a worldview in which ancestry, identity, and cosmology converged, though the exact nature of those beliefs remains just beyond reconstruction, suspended in the absence of comprehensive texts. And as dusk approaches, the low sun casting shadows across the tumuli, and catching the carved stone of the entrances in a soft, angled glow, the necropolis feels less like a cemetery, and more like the fossilized memory of an entire society, a place where architecture became a vessel for preserving relationships between the earthly and the unseen, relationships now perceptible only in the spaces left behind, and the visitor is left with the lingering sensation that the necropolis of Cerveteri, for all its archaeological clarity in some respects, retains an interior silence that hints at a belief system we only partially apprehend, its monumental forms standing as a testament to an ancient intentionality that persists even as its meaning remains suspended, waiting for an interpretive key that may never fully emerge. Monte de Codi Ziggurat. In the northern plains of Sardinia, where the fields stretch in quiet lines toward a horizon softened by coastal haze and the land holds the subtle undulation of ancient geological memory, the Monte de Codi platform rises with a geometry so unexpected that it seems at first glance like an intruder from another tradition, its stepped form evoking distant echoes of Mesopotamian ziggurats, yet standing alone on this island with no architectural relatives to anchor it securely within a known lineage. And as one ascends the long, sloping ramp, its incline gentle yet purposeful, the sense grows that this structure was designed not merely for access, but for procession, a ritual movement carved into the landscape itself, guiding those who once walked here toward a summit whose meaning has been debated for generations. Though the platform's earliest layers suggest a ceremonial function older than any surviving culture's mythology, and beneath the visible stone lies an earlier phase, a massive mound of earth and rock shaped into a truncated pyramid whose creation required knowledge of weight distribution, soil compaction, and spatial symmetry, all emerging at a time when the island's communities are thought to have lived in dispersed settlements with modest architectures, making the ambition of Monte de Codi feel strangely singular, as though a moment of vision crystallized here before fading from the rest of Sardinia's archaeological record, leaving behind this solitary testament to a worldview whose fragments remain scattered across the island's many sacred wells, megalithic tombs, and nuragic towers. Yet, Monte de Codi predates the Nuraghi by millennia, placing it in an epoch where cultural connections across the Mediterranean remain partly speculative, and its resemblance to Near Eastern prototypes raises questions that resist both simplistic diffusion theories and isolated invention models, for while the stepped form and altar-like summit evoke affinities with distant cultures, the structure itself incorporates local stone, local technique, and an orientation that seems to reference Sardinia's own celestial and seasonal rhythms, suggesting that if influence arrived from abroad, it was absorbed and reinterpreted through a distinctly island perspective, creating a hybrid monument that belongs fully to neither world. Contradictions deepen in the stratigraphy, for the earliest phase of the structure appears to align with a Neolithic culture, whose other constructions were megalithic, but not architectural in this sense, implying either an extraordinary surge of ingenuity or a ritual necessity so compelling that it demanded a new form of monumental expression. And the later addition of the stone ramp and outer platform layers during the Copper Age introduces further complexity, suggesting that successive communities may have reinterpreted the site, each layering its own cosmology onto the mound, thus transforming the structure into a temporal palimpsest that records not a single belief system but a sequence of evolving ritual landscapes. Artifacts found around the platform, fragments of pottery, animal bones, and traces of pigment, hint at ceremonies whose scale and solemnity must have drawn participants from far beyond the immediate vicinity. And the presence of a large, upright menhir near the ramp's base contributes to the impression that the complex once included a full ceremonial plaza, now lost to time, where gatherings, offerings, or astronomical observations may have unfolded in alignment with the sun's path or the cycles of the moon, though the absence of written records prevents certainty, leaving only architectural clues and spatial logic to suggest how the monument framed the movements of people and light. And yet, Monte de Codi carries an ambiguity rare, even among prehistoric sites, for while its form is undeniably monumental, its purpose oscillates between interpretations, altar, sanctuary, ceremonial platform, cosmological axis, territorial marker, with none fully encompassing its layered history, as though the structure's meaning shifted along with the communities who used it, each group inheriting the mound's physical presence while projecting new symbolism onto its enduring form, and the stones themselves bear witness to this evolution, some showing signs of reshaping or reworking, others retaining the smooth wear of countless ritual ascents, and still others displaced or eroded in ways that hint at periods of abandonment or transformation, as the island's cultural rhythms changed over millennia. Walking the ramp today, the stones warm beneath the Sardinian sun, the surrounding plains dotted with remnants of prehistoric villages and long buried fields, the visitor feels the peculiar combination of clarity and opacity that defines Monte de Codi, for while the platform's geometry is unmistakable, an engineered expression of elevation and boundary, the intention behind it remains suspended in a quiet tension between the familiar and the alien, a monument that belongs to the Mediterranean, yet stands apart from its mainstream traditions. A structure that resembles a ziggurat, yet emerges from a landscape with no other zigguratic forms, a ceremonial mound whose rituals remain unanchored to surviving myth. And as evening approaches, the slanting light shadows the ramp and the summit, outlining the contours of the platform in a golden gradient that makes its form appear both ancient and strangely modern, its angles crisp against the fading sky, while the surrounding silence evokes the possibility that this was once a focal point, not only for ceremony, but for orientation, spiritual, communal, or astronomical, its elevation granting a vantage over a horizon that, in the Neolithic and Copper Age, might have encoded meanings now forgotten, tied to migrations, seasons, or ancestral narratives lost to the shifting currents of time. And so, Monte de Codi endures as a solitary enigma, a monument that cannot be fully placed within a single tradition or timeline, a structure whose layering of earth, stone, and ritual intention suggests an ancient effort to shape the relationship between humanity, landscape, and sky, an effort that left behind no clear explanation, yet persists in the enduring geometry of its terraces, inviting contemplation of a world where architecture served not only as shelter or symbol, but as a bridge between the visible and the unseen. A bridge now weathered but still standing, silent yet compelling, as though waiting for an interpretive key that may lie not in the stones themselves, but in a fragment of history still undiscovered. Nuraga of Sardinia. In the rugged interior of Sardinia, where the land gathers into rolling ridges and basalt plateaus shaped by ancient volcanic forces, the nuraghi begin to appear like scattered sentinels across the landscape, their conical towers rising from the earth with a solidity that blurs the line between natural formation and human construction, for their weathered stones seem almost grown rather than placed. Yet each is the product of deliberate engineering by a society whose architectural ambition still confounds attempts to assign straightforward meanings. And as one approaches a great nuraghe, Santuantine, Su-Nuraxi, or one of the thousands of lesser-known examples, the sheer mass and precision of its basalt blocks create an immediate impression of intention, carried out at a monumental scale, structured through a system of corbelled chambers, ascending staircases, and internal galleries that suggest both defensive and ceremonial functions, though no single interpretation fully accounts for the complexity found within these stone towers. The Nuragic civilization left no extensive written record to explain its architectural choices, leaving the towers to speak through their geometry and distribution, their placement across ridges, valleys, and coastlines, forming a network so dense that it implies a level of social organization and territorial coherence far beyond what early theories once proposed. While recent archaeological excavations reveal settlements surrounding many nuraghi, complete with meeting huts, workshops, and communal spaces, hinting at societies engaged in metalworking, trade, and ritual activities on a scale that positions them among the most sophisticated Bronze Age cultures of the Mediterranean, even if their cultural identity remains partly opaque. Contradictions arise when comparing the simplicity of the raw materials, unshaped basalt blocks stacked without mortar, to the sophistication of the resulting structures, for the internal chambers rise with a corbelled precision that requires knowledge of load distribution and acoustic behavior, creating spaces that feel at once protective and resonant, their curved walls narrowing toward a high apex that captures sound and light differently across the day, leading some researchers to propose ritual uses, while others emphasize their strategic height and thick walls as evidence of defensive intent. Though the presence of multiple towers within some complexes suggests an architectural language more nuanced than simple fortification. And across Sardinia, the nuraghi stand in incredible numbers, over 7,000 discovered, with likely more still buried or collapsed, creating an impression of a landscape meticulously mapped by stone markers, each tower potentially serving as a node in a network of sightlines, water sources, trade routes, or celestial alignments. For certain nuraghi appear to orient towards solstitial sunrise points or lunar standstill positions, though debates persist over whether these alignments were intentional or coincidental within the island's varied terrain, and the absence of consistent patterns complicates efforts to attribute a singular cosmology to their builders, suggesting instead a mosaic of local traditions unified by a shared architectural framework. The internal chambers, lit only by the narrow entrance and occasional small windows, create a shifting sense of enclosure and expansion as one moves upward through spiral stairways hewn into the thickness of the walls, the darkness giving way to sudden shafts of light that strike the basalt surfaces in a way that emphasizes their texture and mass. And the experience of climbing within a nuragh evokes a sense of journey rather than simple movement, with spatial transitions that seem too intentional to be merely structural, hinting at symbolic pathways tied to ritual or hierarchy, though the lack of written explanation leaves such interpretations suspended in the realm of measured speculation. Excavations reveal layers of use spanning centuries, sometimes millennia, with certain nuraghi showing evidence of initial construction in the Bronze Age, followed by adaptations through the Iron Age and into later periods, creating architectural palimpsests where phases of stonework blend into one another, complicating efforts to isolate their earliest forms, and raising the question of whether the monumental towers we see today represent the culmination of a long tradition or the surviving fragments of a once more varied architectural landscape. Contradictions deepen further when considering the cultural motifs associated with the Nuragic people. Bronze figurines depicting warriors, chiefs, animals, and ceremonial scenes, which reveal a sophisticated symbolic world, but offer few direct clues to how the towers fit into their social or spiritual frameworks, leaving open the possibility that Nuragi served multiple overlapping purposes across generations: fortresses, gathering spaces, sanctuaries, territorial markers, ancestral monuments, or combinations of these roles shaped by shifting cultural needs. And standing beside a towering nurag in the late afternoon, when the basalt blocks absorb the warmth of the sun and release it slowly into the cooling air, the structure seems less like an artifact of human labor and more like a living presence in the landscape, its silhouette merging with the surrounding hills in a way that blurs the boundary between nature and architecture, and the sense grows that the builders were attuned not only to engineering, but to the rhythms of the environment, using stone to articulate relationships between community, land, and sky that remain legible even if their full meanings have been lost. As evening deepens and the shadows lengthen across the plain, the nurage stands silent yet commanding, its corridors empty, but its mass still expressive of an intention that transcends its immediate function, suggesting that it once played a central role in a cultural narrative now fragmented across archaeological traces. And the visitor is left with the impression that the nuragi, with their multitude and their endurance, articulate a worldview framed by permanence and vigilance, by memory anchored in basalt, and by a relationship to time measured not in generations, but in stone, leaving their purpose suspended between interpretation and mystery, a testament to an ancient ingenuity whose full story remains hidden within the island's deep past. Colosseum. In the heart of Rome, where modern traffic coils around ancient footprints and the city's layered history hums beneath every stone, the Colosseum rises with a presence that feels less like a ruin and more like an exposed cross-section of time itself, its great arcades opening like ribs of an organism built to house both spectacle and power. Yet even in its monumental familiarity, the structure retains subtler mysteries often overshadowed by its fame. For beneath the well-known narrative of gladiatorial games lies an architectural intelligence so refined that the amphitheater's very shape becomes a study in ancient experimentation, its elliptical form distributing load and vision with an elegance that belies the brutal entertainments it once held. And as one walks its perimeter, tracing the weathered travertine blocks quarried from distant Tivoli, the interplay of arches and vaults reveals a mastery of engineering that seems almost dissonant with the fragmented records of its construction, suggesting that the Romans, heirs to older Italic, Etruscan, and Mediterranean traditions, may have inherited more than we can clearly trace, their innovations resting atop a substratum of knowledge carried through generations of craftsmen whose names remain unrecorded. Inside, where layers of seating once radiated upward in calculated gradients of hierarchy, the structure's acoustics and visibility reflect a geometry so finely tuned that even modern stadiums echo its logic. Yet below the arena, the hypogeum's labyrinth of corridors and chambers speaks to a level of logistical choreography that has few direct parallels in surviving Roman architecture. Its network of lifts, winches, holding pens, and service passages forming an underground world where the boundary between engineering and theater dissolves into a single calibrated mechanism, though the exact workings of many of these devices remain inferred rather than fully understood. Their wooden components long vanished, leaving only anchor points, grooves, and shadows in stone to hint at their complexity. Contradictions emerge in attempts to reconstruct the timeline of its modifications, for while the Flavian dynasty inaugurated the amphitheater with well-documented fanfare, layers of repairs, retrofits, and shifts in use have obscured the original intent behind certain structural features, such as the enigmatic arrangement of subterranean openings, whose placement suggests not only practical functions, but symbolic or ritual considerations now largely forgotten. And the velarium, its vast retractable awning, presents another puzzle, for though descriptions survive of a naval corps tasked with its operation, the precise rigging system capable of suspending such an immense canopy remains partially speculative, its anchors preserved, but their coordination across the uppermost tiers still debated among scholars who attempt to reconstruct a mechanism that would have required extraordinary coordination and strength. Even the materials speak in layered tones, as the amphitheater's skeleton of travertine, tufa, and brick-faced concrete reveals shifts in Roman building priorities. The use of pozzolanic mortar, allowing the creation of vaults and arches of unprecedented size, yet the precise proportions of these ancient concretes, so durable in some contexts, so vulnerable in others, remain imperfectly replicated today. Their longevity shaped by combinations of ingredients that varied across construction phases, raising the possibility that certain mixes resulted from experiential knowledge now largely lost rather than formalized prescriptions. And as seismic events across the centuries fractured portions of the outer ring, the remaining arcs form a jagged silhouette that both reveals and conceals the logic of the original design, like a monumental cross-section of Roman ambition subjected to geological time. Yet even in its damaged state, the structure retains a coherence that suggests its builders anticipated forces beyond ordinary strain, embedding redundancies and weight-distributing strategies that allowed the amphitheater to endure long after other monuments collapsed. Though whether these choices reflect empirical experience, inherited wisdom, or a deeper understanding of structural behavior remains a question suspended between history and engineering archaeology. Walking the upper levels, where surviving staircases spiral upward in controlled gradients, one feels the intentional flow of movement the architects designed, channeling tens of thousands of spectators through entrances calibrated for efficient dispersal. Their vomitoria, so named for the rapid emptying they enabled, representing an urban-scale choreography rarely matched in antiquity, while the subtle curvature of corridors and the interplay of light and shadow through archways creates an atmospheric rhythm that suggests the architects understood not only structural forces, but human psychology, crafting spaces meant to awe, to direct, and to envelop. Yet despite its fame, the Colosseum retains a quiet enigma in its overall purpose beyond spectacle, for while it clearly functioned as a stage for imperial narratives and social order, its alignment, its siting over a former lake of Nero's palace, and its integration with adjacent structures hint at layers of symbolic realignment, political, spatial, and perhaps cosmological, embedded in its creation. And though these interpretations remain debated, the very ambiguity reflects the complexity of a monument that served not merely as entertainment venue, but as a civic statement inscribed into the city's fabric. As evening falls and the amber lights illuminate the arches, the Colosseum's presence shifts from architectural marvel to something more introspective, its empty corridors and exposed hypogum evoking the dissonance between what is known and what remains speculative, and the visitor is left with the sensation that beneath the well-told history lies another story, of techniques inherited from older Italic builders, of engineering decisions shaped by experience now unrecorded, of symbolic layers overwritten by centuries of repurposing, leaving the amphitheater suspended between clarity and obscurity, its grandeur undeniable, yet its full narrative elusive, a monumental relic from another age whose intentions remain partly concealed within the silence of stone. Pantheon. In the dense heart of Rome, where centuries of streets coil around the lingering imprint of an older city, the Pantheon stands with a serenity that feels almost out of step with the bustle that surrounds it, its rotunda rising not merely as an architectural marvel, but as a quiet enigma whose apparent clarity masks layers of uncertainty, contradiction, and intention that scholars have debated for generations. For while the inscription on its portico credits Marcus Agrippa, the building itself belongs to a later moment, the Hadrianic period. Yet its true conceptual lineage may reach deeper into Rome's architectural memory, drawing on traditions whose roots extend across the Mediterranean, and perhaps even earlier, Italic sacred spaces now lost. Approaching the Pantheon, the first impression is of harmony. the rhythmic colonnade of Egyptian granite, the pediment once adorned with bronze, the broad steps that once faced a different urban layout, all giving the sense of a temple that has always been precisely what it appears to be. Yet this impression dissolves upon entering the rotunda, where the vast interior dome opens like an engineered sky, its coffered hemispheric sweep so perfectly proportioned that it seems to defy the vulnerability of ancient materials, prompting questions about how Roman builders achieved a span of concrete unmatched until modern times, and whether the formula of its mixture, gradually lightening toward the oculus, reflected a standardized knowledge or the accumulated intuition of craftsmen whose expertise is now only partially understood. The oculus itself, a perfect circle of open sky, seems to anchor the building not only to the heavens, but to a cosmological logic encoded in light. For as the sun moves across the day and year, its beam traces deliberate paths along the interior, illuminating altars, niches, and thresholds, with an accuracy that suggests the building functioned as a kind of temporal instrument, marking celestial cycles in ways that transform the rotunda from a static space into a dynamic interplay of architecture and astronomy, though the exact ritual significance of these illuminations remains speculative, informed by fragments of Roman religious practice but never fully confirmed. Within the rotunda, the height and diameter match in a perfect sphere that seems carved from air, yet the engineering behind this illusion reveals a complex interplay of materials: heavy basalt at the base, successively lighter aggregates toward the crown, culminating in pumice near the oculus, a gradient that demonstrates not only structural foresight, but a nuanced understanding of how weight, tension, and cohesion operate in large-scale concrete construction, though no surviving treatises detail the precise knowledge that allowed such precision. Contradictions arise in the interpretation of its purpose, for while tradition frames the pantheon as a temple to all gods, its internal arrangement and lack of surviving cult statuary suggest functions that may have blended religious, dynastic, and ceremonial roles, and some scholars propose that the rotunda served as a symbolic representation of imperial authority, its dome echoing the celestial sphere and aligning the emperor with cosmic order, while others view it as a monumental expression of philosophical ideals, perhaps tied to the Hadrianic court's fascination with geometry, harmony, and the universal. Yet the building's earlier phases complicate this narrative. Beneath the current floor lie remnants of Agrippa's original structure, destroyed by fire, and beneath that, hints of even earlier sacred use of the site, suggesting a continuity of ritual significance that predates the imperial reinterpretation, though the specifics of these earlier traditions remain obscured by the rebuilding that followed. As one moves through the interior, the marble revetments, giallo antico, porphyry, pavonazzetto, form a chromatic map of imperial reach, each stone sourced from distant quarries and transported across land and sea, reflecting not only aesthetic preference but the logistical and political networks that sustained Rome's monumental projects. And the alternating patterns of niches and recesses create a rhythm that guides the eye around the circular plan, reinforcing a sense of movement even within stillness. The bronze that once adorned the portico, later removed for papal use, leaves behind traces that hint at an original facade more ornate than the present one. And the differences in column diameter and spacing suggest logistical adaptations during construction, revealing that even a building as seemingly perfect as the Pantheon carries the marks of practical constraints and evolving design decisions, though these adjustments harmonize within the overall composition in ways that mask their complexity. The structure's survival through earthquakes, fires, and centuries of urban change underscores an engineering resilience that remains partly mysterious. For while the distribution of mass and the integration of relieving arches contribute to its stability, the full combination of factors that allowed the dome to endure while others collapsed is still a subject of research, raising the possibility that certain construction choices were guided by empirical knowledge no longer fully preserved in surviving texts. As daylight shifts and the beam of the oculus drifts across the interior, illuminating the patterned marble floor in an ever-changing arc, the Pantheon reveals itself not as a static monument, but as a living instrument of light, its interior animated by the dialogue between structure and sky. And this interaction hints at meanings beyond conventional temple architecture, suggesting a space where cosmology, politics, ritual, and philosophy may have converged. Yet the absence of definitive records leaves its full significance suspended, inviting interpretations that oscillate between empirical analysis and speculative reconstruction. At sunset, when the oculus glows with fading gold and the dome's coffers retreat into soft shadow, the sense deepens that the Pantheon belongs simultaneously to Rome's historical narrative and to a more elusive lineage of architectural thought, one in which geometry and intention merged into a form that still resists complete explanation. A heritage carried through craftsmanship, inherited knowledge, and a worldview that perceived architecture as a bridge between the human realm and the celestial order. And in this ambiguity, between clarity and enigma, engineering and symbolism, the Pantheon endures as one of antiquity's most profound statements, its meaning still unfolding across the centuries, awaiting interpretations that may never fully resolve the quiet mystery embedded in its perfectly balanced sphere of space and sky. Castel del Monte. In the dry, open expanses of Apulia, where the land rises gently into the limestone plateau of the Merge and the horizon stretches in a pale, uninterrupted arc, Castel del Monte appears with a geometry so deliberate and so austere that it seems less like a medieval fortress and more like an idea rendered in stone, a structure whose form, an octagon surrounded by 8 octagonal towers, has invited centuries of speculation about its purpose, symbolism, and origins. Approaching across the scrubland, where aromatic herbs crunch beneath the foot and the air holds the faint mineral scent of the karst terrain, the castle's pale limestone walls shimmer in the sun, their subtle variations in tone reflecting the region's geological tapestry, and the structure rises with such mathematical clarity that it feels as if the hilltop itself had been awaiting this exact arrangement of angles and proportions, a symmetry so precise that it draws the eye before the details emerge. Built under Emperor Frederick II in the 13th century, or so the inscriptions and documents suggest, the castle nonetheless bears an ambiguity that has sparked theories ranging from astronomical observatory to hunting lodge to esoteric ceremonial site, for its layout eschews defensive features typical of the period. No moat, no curtain walls, no strategic vantage lines, and only minimal provisions for siege, leaving the impression that its purpose lay elsewhere, in realms that combined imperial authority, intellectual curiosity, and symbolic architecture. Stepping inside, the sense of geometric poetry intensifies. The courtyard mirrors the outer octagon, creating a nested rhythm of forms that extend from the towered exterior to the internal void, and the interplay of light and shadow shifts across the courtyard walls in slow, calibrated movements, suggesting that the builders understood how the sun's arc would animate the structure throughout the year. The eightfold symmetry, rare in medieval Europe, has prompted associations with classical architecture, Islamic geometry, and even older Mediterranean numerologies, though no single lineage accounts fully for the castle's form, and the possibility arises that Frederick's court, drawing scholars from across the known world, synthesized diverse traditions into a structure that was less a defensive installation than a spatial thesis. Yet, contradictions emerge within the very walls. Remnants of latrines, drainage channels, and domestic features indicate that the building could support habitation or gatherings, while the absence of kitchens or extensive service quarters complicates interpretations of its function, as though it was designed to host people not in a quotidian sense, but in episodic, possibly ritual or intellectual contexts, where presence mattered more than duration. The interior rooms, arranged in pairs around each floor, follow the octagonal plan with subtle variations, their vaulted ceilings and narrow windows creating patterns of illumination that feel intentional rather than incidental. And some researchers have suggested that the placement of windows corresponds to key astronomical events, though the evidence remains debated, complicated by later modifications and the erosion of contextual clues. The castle's orientation, though not perfectly aligned with cardinal directions, shows consistent angular relationships that may indicate a symbolic logic now obscured by time, and the proportional relationships between height, diameter and wall thickness reveal mathematical harmonies rarely seen in medieval architecture, hinting at an underlying architectural doctrine that has not survived in written form. The very choice of location, on a hill neither the highest nor the most strategic, raises further questions. If not for defense, why here? The answer may lie in the castle's visibility from the surrounding plains, where its silhouette becomes a near geometric figure against the horizon, suggesting that its presence was intended as a conceptual anchor in the landscape, a statement of imperial intellect and authority, framed not through military power, but through architectural mastery. Yet, this interpretation competes with others. The castle's proximity to ancient roots, its alignment with sightlines to distant settlements, and its relative isolation from urban centers all contribute to a layered ambiguity, where each hypothesis illuminates one facet of the structure while leaving others in shadow. The materials themselves offer clues and contradictions. The limestone blocks bear tool marks consistent with skilled masons, yet certain joints display a level of precision that feels almost anachronistic for the period, while the interiors once held polished marble revetments and detailed fittings now long removed, their absence creating an austere atmosphere that may not reflect the castle's original sensory impact. Frescoes and decorative elements uncovered in fragments suggest a richer visual environment than the bare walls convey today, implying that the castle's intellectual austerity was complemented by artistic or symbolic narratives now largely lost, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct meaning from fragments of pigment and pattern. As one ascends the internal staircases, spiral flights embedded within the towers, the sense of movement becomes part of the architectural experience, guiding the visitor upward through controlled shifts of light and perspective until emerging onto higher levels, where the landscape unfolds in all directions. The plains, hills, and distant coastline appearing as part of a vast diagram in which the castle is the central point. It is here that some researchers propose an astronomical or calendrical dimension, for the castle's height and open sightlines could have framed celestial observations. Yet, without explicit records, this remains conjectural, part of the broader mosaic of interpretations that reflect the castle's enigmatic form. By dusk, when the limestone takes on a muted rose hue and the shadows sharpen into elongated octagonal shapes across the ground, Castel del Monte feels less like a remnant of medieval ambition and more like a conceptual artifact, a structure whose purpose may have blended imperial display, philosophical inquiry, and symbolic alignment into a single architectural gesture. Its clarity of form contrasts with the opacity of its meaning, leaving the visitor suspended between understanding and wonder, confronted with a monument that offers itself to analysis, yet resists definitive interpretation. And in this tension, between its documented past and its deeper, more elusive significance, the castle stands as a testament to an age where knowledge, symbolism, and authority intersected in stone, leaving behind a structure that remains as compelling in its mystery as in its geometry, an enduring challenge to those who seek to read its intentions through the shifting light of time. Etruscan Via Cava. In the forested heartlands of southern Tuscany, where the hills fold into each other like softened layers of ancient seabed, and the trees gather in dense canopies that mute the wind, the Etruscan Via Cava appear not as roads carved through rock, but as deep, narrow corridors where the land itself has been shaped into passageways of startling verticality, their walls rising in sheer tufa cliffs that enclose the traveler in a space both intimate and monumental, creating the uncanny sensation of walking through a geological memory rather than a human construction. These sunken roads, some plunging more than 20 meters into the earth, cut through the volcanic bedrock with a precision and scale that challenge easy explanations. For while they clearly served as pathways, their depth and steepness seemed disproportionate for ordinary transit, and the sheer labor required to carve such trenches into the hillside suggests a significance beyond simple movement between settlements. Many of the Via Cava connect necropoles to hilltop towns, their walls bearing faint traces of niches, carvings, and erosion patterns that hint at ceremonial or symbolic functions, as though these corridors once framed processions of the living toward the domains of the dead, guiding footsteps through delineated spaces where the boundary between world and underworld was negotiated not abstractly, but through architecture etched into the bones of the landscape. Yet the purpose of the Via Cava remains entangled in contradictions. Their dates are difficult to anchor, for the soft tufa erodes and reshapes over centuries, obscuring tool marks and stratigraphic clues, and while the Etruscans surely used them, some scholars argue that the earliest cuts may predate Etruscan settlement, remnants of pathways whose origins lie in earlier Italic or even Bronze Age communities whose traces are now fragmented. Others point to the hydrological functions these corridors might have served, drainage channels, water management systems. Yet the precision of certain curves, intersections, and heights implies a level of planning that exceeds functional necessity, and the presence of carved niches at regular intervals suggests ritual or symbolic uses now obscured by erosion and time. In places the walls rise so high and the trench narrows so abruptly that daylight filters down in shifting patterns, creating an interplay of illumination and shadow that changes with the hour, and one wonders whether the builders intended this dramatic choreography of light, turning the act of passage into an experience of descent and emergence, a spatial narrative that mirrors mythic journeys described in later traditions. As one walks through these corridors today, the surfaces of the tufa show a record of water flow, roots, and centuries of footfall, the walls etched with vertical streaks where rain has carved channels that mimic the original cutting marks, creating a palimpsest in which natural and human interventions blur. Certain via cava intersect with others in angular formations that seem almost mathematical, forming networks carved into hillsides without clear evidence of fortification or settlement directly above, suggesting a system whose logic we can track physically but not fully interpret, as though we are seeing the connective tissue of a cultural landscape whose organs, the villages, sanctuaries, and ceremonial sites, have been largely erased. At the entrances to some corridors, carved steps lead upward to lookout points or small platforms whose original uses remain speculative, and in others, faint openings in the walls reveal chambers that may have served funerary, votive, or storage functions, though the lack of consistent patterns makes definitive interpretation elusive. The Via Cava also carry an acoustic dimension rarely noted in formal studies. Within their narrowest stretches, sound amplifies and rebounds, footsteps echo with unusual clarity, and voices take on a resonant quality that transforms the corridor into a kind of natural amplifier, an effect that could have imbued ancient processions, chants, or ritual recitations with an atmospheric power difficult to replicate elsewhere. Whether intentional or incidental, this auditory phenomenon adds another layer of complexity to the question of their purpose, hinting that the builders may have understood not only the spatial, but the sensory possibilities of carving pathways into the earth itself. Contradictions further emerge when examining their distribution. Some via cava cut directly toward necropoleias, reinforcing the idea of funerary or ritual processions, while others lead to springs or water sources, suggesting practical functions. Still others connect settlements indirectly, bypassing more efficient routes, implying that symbolic or territorial considerations guided their placement. The absence of consistent width or uniform depth hints at modifications across generations, with different communities reshaping older corridors for new uses, creating composite passageways whose cumulative evolution obscures the intentions of their earliest phases. And the geological nature of the tufa, soft when first exposed, hardening with time, adds another layer of uncertainty. How much of what we see represents the original cut, and how much has been softened or reshaped by erosion, root systems, and centuries of rainfall. Walking through one of the longest stretches near Sovana or Pitigliano, where the walls close in so tightly that the sky becomes a narrow ribbon overhead, the passage transforms into a liminal space where the present feels suspended and the past seems closer than the surface world just above. Moss clings to the upper ledges, and in shaded sections the air cools suddenly, as though the corridor maintains its own microclimate, separate from the surrounding forests and fields. Emerging from such a passage into the sharp brightness of the Tuscan sun creates a shift so abrupt it feels ceremonial, even if its original purpose remains obscured. And in this interplay of depth and emergence, light and enclosure, function and symbolism, the Via Cava reveal themselves as more than simple roads. They are the carved arteries of an ancient landscape whose cultural pulse has faded, leaving behind a network of pathways that defy easy categorization, their intentions fractured across time, yet still palpable in the experience of moving through them. As evening settles across the hills, and the shadows within the corridors lengthen into dark vertical bands, the sense grows that these sunken roads once held meanings we can only partially reconstruct, shaped by communities whose relationship to the land was expressed not through structures rising upward, but through pathways carved downward into the earth itself. And in their enduring ambiguity, part engineering, part ritual, part mystery, the Via Cava remain among Italy's most atmospheric ancient creations, a testament to a worldview where movement, landscape, and memory were intertwined in ways that continue to resonate even as their original purpose remains suspended just beyond reach.